Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Political Geekfest in the middle of Easter school holidays, which is why I'm even more relaxed than normal. Hi, Katharine from the bubble.
Hello, welcome to our well-oiled machine.
Oh, my goodness. As we were, so paying respects to traditional owners around the country, welcoming you all here, recognising the land we're all on was never ceded, and recognising that we've just got a whole lot of fresh data that I think creates a really interesting pinch point in the way this political year is unfolding. For those of you that are new to the Geekfest, it's pretty loose. We're just going to go through the numbers. I'm going to throw a whole bunch of, mainly full tosses, maybe a couple of curveballs at Katharine, and see where it all lands. You're really welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, but also put questions and comments, and we'll try to bring a few of you into the conversation as we kick along. But Katharine, before we jump into the numbers, I know there was a week where there was just no Katharine Murphy in The Guardian, and I know a number of us were bereft, but you took a week off and you've come back, and it feels like there's been an atmospheric change over the last week, and that sense of the crisis around gender has kind of also almost been overtaken by the crisis in vaccines. So I'm just interested in whether you've picked up some sort of shift, and if in any way it's good for the government.
Well, it's sort of, we thought before Brittany Higgins came along in the middle of February that the biggest political story of the year would be the vaccination rollout. That was our working assumption. Then Brittany Higgins' arrival introduced a new fascinating multi-layered and important story as well that none of us had really forecast. No one had that one in their diaries. That one just came out of left field and came hard, and had a lot of other elements attached to it. So I think you're right, Peter, in the sense that there's been a bit of a gear shift, that now we're back to the main, what we forecast would be the main political story of the year, which is the vaccination rollout. And there's been a lot of attention around that in the past week because the deficiencies in the planning for that have come to the fore spectacularly, as well as obviously new information or more concrete information about some of the downside risks potentially with one of the vaccines, the AstraZeneca one, which happens to be the one that we invested pretty much all our hopes in. So, but look, I don't necessarily see this as a mortal combat situation. As I'm talking to you, Christine Holgate, who is the former head of Australia Post, is giving some pretty electrifying evidence before a Senate committee, some of which has a distinct overtone of gender attached to it as well. And the Holgate and a couple of offsiders who have fronted that committee have chosen to turn up today in suffragette white, just to make their point, just in case anyone was inclined to look elsewhere or miss the point. So look, that's a long-winded preamble that says vaccines are certainly back to the fore. I anticipate that vaccines will be at the fore for all of this year, particularly given the likelihood now that that we won't have a nationwide rollout by year's end. It looks highly unlikely that will be the case. So this story will be prosecuted vigorously over the coming months. But I also strongly suspect that the women's story, and that's another thread in the data that we've got this fortnight to share with people. Scott Morrison's problem with female voters isn't going anywhere, and also there's been a little bit of a sense that perhaps there's a bit of a downtick in support among male voters as well, although it's sort of more within the margin of error of the poll. Anyway, so I'm hedging my bets. I think both of these stories are pretty important, and I think both of them will be with us for some months yet.
And I've, as someone that's probably not totally independent in these debates, been looking, when I thought the year was going to be about the vaccination, I thought it would work to the benefit of the incumbents. There were a couple of warning signs, though, in our polling earlier this year that there was an expectation that it would be done efficiently and expeditiously, and there was a sense we'd done the virus so well, we're going to do the dismount really well as well. And I thought it was setting up the scene for a pretty smooth re-election campaign towards the end of this year. Now, obviously the gender interrupted that, but what's been interesting to me from the cheap seats has been that with the little glitches that are starting to come from the fore, and frankly, the heightened expectations and then the under delivery that seems to have become stock in trade, particularly for this Prime Minister, that and I don't know if this is a metaphor searching for an analysis or what it is, but I do feel like the point of political immunity from the crisis is over, and there's a lot more accountability being built into the equation now.
Well, it sort of depends. Look, I agree with that at a very helicopter level, but the fact is we're not out of the crisis, and the debacle of the vaccine rollout sort of exemplifies that point. There is a mass vaccination program that is running very successfully in the US and the UK, who have been two, distinctly underperforming jurisdictions during the pandemic, but nonetheless are rolling out competent vaccination programs. In Australia, we've still got a winter to come. And the vaccination program is off the rails at the most dangerous time of the year, which is the winter. So I think you're right, Pete, in the sense of that psychologically the country has moved past the crisis in a way, because the economy's more or less roaring back. Businesses and services are more or less back to where they were, except obviously not travel and obviously not people coming in and out of the country. But there is a more, settled sense of normalcy in the country this year than last year. And even if we get an outbreak during the winter, the contact tracing systems in the States are probably going to be up to the task of managing that, because that was the kind of trajectory we ran last winter, right? Like was getting up to the task. But going to your point, which is, are we post-crisis, right? In the political psychology of the country, well, if the vaccination program was running out smoothly, I would say yes, decidedly we are, because it's there's no community transmission, touch wood. And the sort of buffer against the virus, i.e. the vaccination, the inoculation programs all running out. People then can see an end point. Now the government's had to put back the end point, because
actually take away the end point.
Take away the end point.
Is now
X. So, yes, and it's sort of like, in a crude sense, right? The crisis has suited the government in the sense that they've been seen to manage it more or less competently. But now the government's removed the endpoint of a crisis, which it's now being seen to not manage competently. So what does that mean? How does that flow through the political system? Well, that'll be the story of the next, several weeks and months. I think the data does show us, though, Pete, doesn't it, that people are attuned to this being a multifactorial situation. They're sufficiently across the issues to know that there are supply chain issues, there are production issues potentially, that all of these things are valid and relevant. But the government still does have to front the poor bet it made in investing so much store in one particular vaccine, which has been demonstrated now to have some side effects for a limited group of people, some dangerous side effects for a limited group of people. So I honestly don't know how this plays out. But I think if you were the government, you would be very, very worried about how this would play out, because as our polling sort of shows, it sets the scene across both of these two stories. A sort of level of impatience with what's going on with the vaccination program, and also the Prime Minister's slump with women voters. Both of these things are present in this. We've got this lovely snapshot, I guess, of the beginning of a story that may not be that favourable for the government over the next sort of 6 months or so.
Yeah, I took that as a bit of a segue to jump into the numbers, just because otherwise we'll just talk ourselves around and then we'll have nothing to say when the slides have come up. There's already a couple of really interesting questions in the chat about what this means in terms of election timing, but we might just leave that till we've gone through the numbers. This was one of our monthly, and special thanks to John Remington, who's put together these tables for today, and we'll get John to help us dig a bit deeper. We'll start off, as we do once a month, just with approval of the performance of the two leaders, and then we'll move into some of the specific vaccine questions. So this shift in approval of the job the PM's doing is moving. We're now at our lowest level of approval and the highest level of disapproval, I think, since the bushfires. That said, it's still net positive.
Yeah. You'd be happier to be, sort of north of 50 than not if you were Scott Morrison.
Yeah. And again, the interesting story though is this one. With women, you're not.
Yeah.
You're down to 46. We look earlier in the early days of the rule of ScoMo, and that was kind of where we were. We dropped down to the low 30s when he didn't turn up for work over summer of 2020. But that decoupling, I just think, is really a fascinating feedback loop on what's been happening. And it hasn't stopped happening in the last week or two either. I'm interested particularly in your read, Katharine, on the government's response and then the counter response to the Kate Jenkins report, the Respect at Work. For people who don't know, that was a broad look at workplace harassment, which had a really significant structural change, which would have been to shift the duty of care effectively onto the employer to provide safe, which is almost an extension of OH&S, and I guess they could argue it is just another layer of OH&S, but it seemed to be going a little bit further. But that's the one bit that that Kate Jenkins proposed that seems to have been stopped in its tracks.
Yeah, that's right, and that was a very critical recommendation of a whole bunch of reforms that she put forward in the report the government sat on for 12 months, and the Prime Minister had a press conference saying, look, we're absolutely on board with all this Kate Jenkins stuff, plus a couple of things that she didn't think of, but then when the fine print came out, one of the major recommendations of her report was not taken up by the government. So the other problem too is that sort of Morrison's sort of in the middle of this pivot, or trying to basically convince female voters that he's not terrible. And that's been sort of playing out over the last couple of weeks, and will continue to play out in the lead up to the budget. I think the government will try and pull this trend back, but there were, as you say, there were a couple of issues last week where that it was part of Operation, sort the women, for want of a better term. But it became tangled up too in the vaccination program starting to roll off the rails as well. So one kind of overshadowed the other, and because the response in this issue has been sort of one step forward, two steps back the whole way. That's a dynamic that the government's sort of established for itself, at least in terms of relating to women. So it's going to be a lot more than a lot more will be required here, I think, than we've done some of Kate Jenkins' stuff, but not all of it. And yeah. Anyway,
well, it just leaves a sense that you set up processes to manage issues, but then if you don't embrace the outcomes, then the process doesn't resolve the issue. So it feels to me that it's just another area where the government's going to remain vulnerable.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think, what our data has established is that there is this gender gap, and I think the government will be taking comfort from the fact that there's this downtick in male approval is not massive, that the curve so far is not following the women, although it's not nothing either. They'll be taking some comfort in that, right? That the country's divided, therefore you're back in a sort of 50+1 scenario. We only need, it's down to the maths of winning, right? It's I think anyway. My own gut feeling about this is that it's not a decline with women that you can arrest with a bunch of announceables. It's sort of what women I think have been looking for throughout this. This crisis that's been visited on the Parliament, this Me Too reckoning, is for the government to stop managing things politically, to respond to things as thoughtful humans rather than seeking always to deal with this by damage control. I think, and it's not clear to me that the Prime Minister's really got that.
I don't think they've even got a roadmap to do that, though. What does that even look like?
Well, it is difficult if you can't pull yourself out of that mindset. It's
even the quotas that they were pulling out, like for that to have a meaningful impact, as Labor shows, it's a 20-year project.
Yeah, it is. Even if everyone's on board, it's a 20.
Back in the 90s.
Yeah, no, it's quite difficult. So anyway, I think the women's issue is very, very difficult for the government to navigate. They'll, like I said, they'll have these plus side feelings. Oh well, at least the blokes haven't fallen off the cliff as well. There's something here we can work with. We can try and, persuade back a cohort of women who will continue to listen to us or be open to our appeals. But I think this is genuinely a very difficult government for this particular issue, I should say, a difficult issue for this government to manage because of the way that it conducts itself and its instincts. And then you overlay that with a vaccination program running off the rails and you've got some interesting conditions.
Good times. One other thing we should mention about this before we move on, and I see the blokes numbers have dropped a bit, but John did the crosstabs on last week's figures where we'd had that flatlining at 65% support for blokes, and there'd actually been 10% increase of support amongst three cohorts. Younger males, lower income males and regional males, which kind of creates a little bit of a counter story that there is a cohort in the population that's sitting back and watching what's going on and likes what they're seeing from the Prime Minister.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say with the blokes. There will be this supposition, although on those crosstabs, we do need to make the point that that's very small sample size.
Thank you. Yes, that should always be stated. And I don't know, John, if that stands up this week either. I don't know if you've dug that far this time. He's shaking his head. Maybe he can delve in even as we're speaking and break some more news as we go.
Pressure. No pressure.
Well, let's talk about the other side. Anthony Albanese, what's been remarkable is things have bounced around. On one side has been the stability, I think, in the numbers. I do note disapproval's up a tad, approval down, but that's probably just noise. If you look at that really right through the lockdown, that's pretty much in the range, although I must say approval's at the lower end. The really interesting number here, Katharine, is amongst female voters. If you broke up that approval, disapproval and don't know, it's 31 approve, 33 disapprove and 36 don't know. And that's actually double the number of men saying they don't have a view on the performance of Albo. Now, I'm not quite sure what to make of that. Is that a cohort saying we're not engaged in politics, or Anthony Albanese is not engaging with us? Like, it
could
we
be.
Don't know, but
we don't. First point, we don't know. Second point is could be either. Genuinely, sort of that the women with young kids are the kind of white whale demographic cohort of politics. It's the cohort that everybody's obsessed with communicating with, because the women, very busy women, are really hard to reach in terms of political targeting and messaging. So because they're not as engaged, because they've got a lot on their plate, they're balancing a million different responsibilities. So it could just reflect that there's a hard group to target, aren't really listening to you. Like that seems a logical conclusion. But it also could mean that Albanese is not doing enough to send up a signal that women should be listening to. I don't think we can sort of absolve him of responsibility for that result either. So, and it is interesting, given that the sort of really signature policy that Labor's put out post-election is a childcare policy, which would be designed to speak to that cohort of women who are very difficult for political parties to reach. So look, either way, whether it's just a function of busy life or whether it's a function of them being underwhelmed by him, it suggests that Labor and the opposition leader have, as Kevin Rudd was fond of saying, a job of work to do.
Mm. Yeah, the reality is that I think it's only now that the political contest is engaging in earnest. So if you take that tortured metaphor that the immunity period's ending and now the government is, open to some degrees of political infection, away we go. In terms of preferred prime minister, it's still what it is, 47% Morrison. I note that's the lowest it's been since
12 months.
April last year.
Yeah.
But it's not catastrophic for them yet either, although I think there is a bit of a growing sense that people are ready to look at something else.
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting, like the movement, obviously, bit of movement to Albanese, bit of movement to, not sure, which indicates, which sort of speaks to your thesis that we're sort of, we may be entering a more contested period, like genuinely contested period, which would put us on the other, sort of out the other side of the crisis mode. But I just caution again, we're not out of the crisis, and the crisis does benefit incumbents, but does the crisis benefit incumbents who have been seen to mess up things? Well, that's a live test that we're sort of entering now.
Just one more, the risk of overwatching this, but the real differences in preferred PM amongst women and men, and that really high don't know cohort amongst women. So there is a story that says that there is something shifting here.
Yeah, definitely. It's fascinating, actually.
The other thing that's side by side is the government's response is weakening. This has been the really stable number for them all the way through, this sense of, although there was a bit of a glitch 2 weeks or last month, but 62% still say the government's either doing a very good or quite good job. And that's obviously down from sort of the baseline for most of the year, or the last 12 months. And likewise, John, a little bit of a dip for each of the state governments as well, which I only just noticed now. Like they're still all in, pretty solid shape, but it does again speak to this sense, I think, that the focus has moved from public health crisis to what do we do next? Yeah,
it does. It does suggest that. It suggests that over this fortnight, people have moved themselves psychologically out of the immediate crisis mode, and that makes sense because there's been no community transmission and no big outbreaks. But again, the variables in front of us are winter and a delayed vaccination program. But anyway, correct. That was actually for John, and I just burst in there. So John, just
he can nod.
Not at all. Yeah, I think it's one of the first times we've seen that kind of universal shift across all states, and that little drop at a national level as well. I think, as you said, it's quite reactionary, these charts as we've seen with Victoria when there was that lockdown where you can see the drop in March. So it's very much, I think, this kind of short-term immediate outlook, as Katharine said, of what are we faced with now rather than what might be coming up in the next few weeks and months.
Which is sort of interesting too, just like quickly, because there's a fair bit of noise like in the numbers. People are really kind of seem to be shifting to events in real time, which is sort of fascinating to me at a couple of levels. It's kind of like, it suggests that people are more engaged than usual. Like, these are just mass generalizations here, so forgive me, but it does suggest that they are a bit more engaged than usual. If we think this is an accurate track, right? If we do think there's a causal link between what people are telling us in the poll and what's happening in politics. It's sort of, so it indicates sort of greater engagement, which is interesting, but also sort of a bit more volatility, which is also interesting, because it sort of speaks to an environment where you can only know what you know now, which is again very much a function of the crisis, right? Like no one can plan anything. Nobody can really, bank on their marvelous, adventure to wherever in 6 months' time. We have been socialized by this crisis over the last sort of 18 months to live in the now, that's all that can be known. And I don't know, I'm just sort of looking at some of the noise in the numbers, I just wonder whether people are still in that mindset. Anyway, I'll stop raving. It's just a sort of
it's a good, and we'll move into the vaccines. Just to that point though, it was interesting when the Prime Minister made the announcement, I think it was on Thursday night, we were going, we better go and boost our sample up to see what the impact of the announcement's going to be. There was actually no difference between the people that had answered the questions before and after. Like, this is actually more, it's not just responding to
not all reactive.
I think there is a sense that this is just now the new normal. So this is interesting. Which of the following best describes your view on how quickly Australians are being vaccinated? And I think, John, the full words of this was more slowly than I'd like, or about the right speed, or more quickly. So we've got 1 in 5 saying that we're actually putting stuff in people's arms too fast, which I think is interesting. And I don't know if there's any crosstabs there to show who's thinking that, John. But the majority of people now saying this is happening too slow. And it speaks to me, I guess, of two things. One is winter is coming. The second thing is I do sense also that potentially the vaccinations are now being seen as part of the economic story, the sense that it needs to happen before the country can open up, as opposed to just being about, it's not like people are sitting around going, I'm worried that people aren't being vaccinated because the virus is running amok, because it's not. But in terms of that economic story.
Exactly. It's sort of where we differ from, I don't know, if voters, are being asked these questions in the UK and the US, so we're sort of processing through different lenses, right? In those jurisdictions where infections have just run massively off the rails, people will want the vaccination program for public health reasons. They will want that in order to not die of coronavirus. Whereas in Australia, because the sort of the curve of infections has been suppressed, it's more when can life return to normal, and the vaccination program is a proxy for that. It's sort of when can we get about our normal business.
Yeah. Interestingly,
just in terms of the crosstabs on that, Peter. Yeah, there were some big differences, and we've put those in the full report, which people can access online. I think Afsa put the link up in the chat earlier. Over 55s, a lot more concerned about the speed of the vaccine rollout. There you've got 73% saying it's happening slower than they would like. So they are definitely the people who it's not happening quick enough. So you then see the age split with younger people saying more likely to say it's happening a little bit faster than they would like. Males more likely than women to say it's happening faster, 24% compared to 17%. And then, as Peter said, we did have a look at what happened before and after that big announcement on Thursday in terms of the vaccine rollout. And in terms of the speed, there wasn't anything that we picked up which was significantly different. So over the weekend, there wasn't a sense that what was announced has really affected that people's views on the speed of that rollout.
We also went a bit funky, and for those who thought the rollout was too slow, we asked them what was to blame or who was to blame. And as you can see from these numbers, predominantly it was federal government, not majority. A quarter of people saying international supply chains, basically no one blaming the states and territory government. So this is really one where there is a level of that accountability that's building into the political narrative, particularly about those who don't think it's going particularly well.
Yeah, and if we sort of think back to aged care, which was the other area of government responsibility, when that was a thing, probably this time 12 months ago, or a little bit past this time 12 months ago, Perceptions were a bit more split about who was responsible. People were a bit more confused about who, maybe it was the state's fault, maybe it was the Commonwealth's fault. Here it's pretty bleedingly obvious who's going to carry the can in the event this rollout turns into a complete debacle.
Yeah, I might also call up Craig Gear, who's in the room, who runs the Older People's Advocacy Network. I was just interested from Craig's perspective, what you're hearing from the people you represent around the vaccine, and whether our kind of assumptions as slightly younger people who aren't sort of living in high risk cohorts is accurately reflected. I don't know if you
can it's interesting, Peter. I came off meetings last week with and we were talking about post Thursday night's announcements, and very much then into our older person's reference group, and they were telling me, just get on and do this. We don't care which one. We want to just get on and do this and get this. And I feel like this is becoming a distraction. The really interesting one is the concern I have around sort of some of the ageism that creeps into this as well. We just had a Royal Commission. We're about to hear, hopefully in the May budget, some response to that. And the concern that, oh, well, we might move and change the vaccinations and now sort of use more Pfizer for young people and give older people AstraZeneca. And while the science kind of says it works for both, again, moving midstream is just another confusing message. So older people are telling us that they want really clarity in the communications and the messaging, and then that timing of the communications needs to be, they want the information, they want it now, sort of thing. So I think they definitely want the aged care workforce vaccinated as well. So I think that's the hard thing that people have had, that they've seen frontline healthcare workers, great, getting that, quarantine workers, great, residents, great. But what about the workforce and other people, the older people in the community as well? So there's definitely it's going too slow. We want this now. But we want accurate information as well.
And do you feel that the desire for the action is linked to, I wouldn't say the word concern of personal health, or just they want things to be over in the sense of constraint to be over?
It's a bit of both. I think that the older population have told us that they're used to getting vaccines. They've had smallpox, polio, those sorts of things. They've lived through that. So they've got confidence, more confidence probably than some cohorts in the vaccination and trusting the TGA. But they are tired of being the ones that have been the most restricted over this period, particularly those in residential aged care who have sometimes been told that they're not allowed to leave their facility, which is their home, whereas everyone else is allowed to go out and do exercise. So it's a fascinating story of saying, well, yes, we want to get back to normal as well. We want to actually still see our families, but they're also then, it'll be interesting then how this plays in with what is said or isn't said around the results of the funding to support the Royal Commission recommendations.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Craig, for sharing that. Katharine, we are in a weird world where, with all these things, we kind of become experts in whatever's in front of us. And now there's all these different vaccines on the table. And I am still curious about whether people are now rating, that your Pfizer is better than your AstraZeneca and where's the Moderna, or if it is just give us a plan and do it. Like that. If there is this very deep engagement that it's almost like a branded vaccine thing now, that creates one set of political challenges. I suspect, though, it is much more about where am I going to get a shot. I think people under 50 probably will take the advice, but it's not, they'll go and get a shot and not really focus on whether it's an AstraZeneca or what it is. The numbers are
possibly, but I think that some of the problem about the way the recalibration of the program's been handled in recent days is that that if you just sort of consume this at several steps back, what the message you would have got is something's up with the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's up sufficiently for the government to basically chuck out vaccination targets that it's had and just say, well, actually, we can't have those targets anymore. So that puts a big question mark again, if you're a very informed person, you can read between the lines of all of that, and you can make an intelligent decision based on the information that politicians are giving you and health advice and all that sort of stuff. If you're several steps back from that, though, the danger in the whole reaction about the AstraZeneca stuff is that it sort of it supercharges vaccine hesitancy. That's the risk. Now, obviously, the government's obliged to be frank with people about what the risks of the various therapies are, the vaccinations are. I mean, it would be ridiculous if they weren't, and negligent if they weren't. But, back to sort of Craig's point about people want clear information and they want it sort of more or less in real time. The downside of that is that these fumbles can happen sort of in full public view, and we saw that certainly at the peak of the crisis, when Morrison was having these 9 p.m. press conferences about lockdowns. It was completely confusing. People were not getting, a clear messaging about things. And we've seen that pattern repeat, I think, over the last week in the vaccinations. Now, the government's got a bit of time to get its act together and get its messaging clearer around the various vaccinations, what you should or shouldn't do, and it has all the resources in order to do that. But it's been pretty inelegant, and that will be disconcerting, certainly, as Craig says, for older Australians, but also for a lot of Australians, I think, who now will be kind of like, oh God, should I get the AstraZeneca or not?
So the flow-on effects of the hesitancy, and we didn't have that in the field this week, and I'm kind of glad we didn't, because I want to see it next week when there's been a bit of space for it to move. Right. But the other thing we found interesting was on a couple of the propositions around economic measures, such as the vouchers for travel. The messages that tended to resonate most with respondents were the ones which were, I'm not going to be planning travel until the vaccine's rolled out anyway. And it was kind of similar when we get to the JobKeeper, JobSeeker dropping off, that should go until the vaccine's been rolled out. So the vaccine, as I kind of was clumsily trying to say before, I don't think it's just a public health measure. It's also an economic measure. And I think the government's actually more vulnerable if economic repercussions are seen to be driven through the flawed rollout. Like, of course, if there are outbreaks and people die, that is terrible. But in terms of where we are at the moment, I suspect the risk is more the economic one, and losing that sense that they're more they're the party to manage the economy.
Yeah.
Federal government performance. There were a few mixed messages here. It's kind of interesting. 56% federal government needs to step up and take more responsibility, which is not their natural habitat. 48% agree. And when we say 48, it's not 52 disagreeing. We're normally got 15 to 20% don't know. So these are significant majorities, these numbers. Slower than expected rollout indicates the federal government is not doing as good a job as they claimed, but a similar number of people agreeing that delays in the distribution of COVID vaccines are due to circumstances outside the federal government's control. In our game, you kind of message box and you say what we're going to try to say and what they're going to say. That's kind of, that 48, 47 is probably the message box as it is at the moment. I think the difficulty, though, with the government argument is it gets into that I don't hold a mate territory, which is now a weakness for the government. So I don't know if through chance or design, but the lack of responsibility is becoming a little bit of an Achilles heel for the Prime Minister. Yeah,
well, it's certainly a pre-existing idea that sort of the government or the Prime Minister has sown for himself, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like it's a pre-existing notion. But even though, look, I know these numbers look contradictory in the sense of the government's, it's the government's fault. Oh, it isn't the government's fault. But again, that to me only just sort of indicates, I think I said this before, but possibly not in English, but that people are dealing with or are across these issues enough to know that multiple realities exist at the same time. They can see that at the sort of international level, between vaccine nationalism, production issues, supply issues. Everybody knows that's complex, that there are a whole set of factors that are genuinely beyond the Commonwealth's control. However, even though that reality exists, the government's still being measured. In a way, I think this reflects a fairer judgment, is what I'm trying to say. It's sort of like, it's not a visceral judgment. It's not, I just hate that guy and I have no reason other than my gut feeling. It's, I am actually across this issue. I know there are problems at the international level, but I can also see with my own eyes in front of me the Commonwealth underperforming in this issue that is actually very important both to my health and to economic recovery. So, you know, I think this is actually, myself, I think these are a really interesting and strong set of numbers, because it sort of indicates that it's not just an off the top, you know, whatever response. It's I get this, I understand this, I'm following this closely, I know what's happening internationally, and I know that the government before me is not performing as well as it purports to. And then,
you know, that's the interesting observation, because I think so much of the ballast of the last 12 months has been people looking overseas and seeing how much comparatively better off we were in Australia.
Exactly.
Now they're looking and saying, well, comparatively, it's not that we're worse off, but we're not performing with the same degree of urgency, coordination, or effectiveness.
Exactly.
I thought, you know, Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales yesterday, taking, you know, even through this, there's been very few salvos, but that statement that she feared Australia was being left behind is a really interesting framer that opens up a huge, I think, political opportunity also for Labor.
Well, and particularly because we started this conversation with, you know, you sort of in a way kind of referring to the curse of high expectations, Pete, right? Because the government's been seen to manage things competently in the past by a majority of voters, and that becomes, you know, becomes the albatross around your own neck in a way, because there's a basis for comparison. So it's sort of, you know, and we could all ask Wayne Swan about how much voters thank you for
stopping
keeping the country out of recession, or, you know, whatever else, right? So so they're pretty tough markers, the voters, and but in a way it's worse, in a way, because the government has created, or the governments of Australia through coordinated and largely competent actions over the last 12 months have created this sense of Australian exceptionalism in the pandemic. If we go from that scale, exceptionalism, to the other scale, which is that we can't run out, you know, this really critical element of the response, well, then perhaps the reaction to that becomes more visceral. I don't know. We're going to have to see.
Yeah. You know, the other thing that strikes me looking back to the GFC, you know, back then the government got into trouble when it tried to deliver services. You're hearing that GPs have been investing in cooling systems and then don't hear squat from the government. There seems to be pushback at state government ideas of setting up stadium vaccinations. It just seems like they're not playing on their home turf with this either.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this, and I'll just say this quickly. I think because, like, if we look at this through the lens of the Commonwealth response, what is the Commonwealth responsible for in the pandemic? Well, I know there's a school of thought out there in the community that, oh, well, Canberra did nothing. It just capitalised on largely smart decisions by the states in the management of the pandemic. And that is true on the health side. But on the economic side, the government made a lot of really big decisions, actually, and ran that economic response. And I think basically with the government or the institutions of government, and by that I'm talking about Treasury, have recent experience with either a recession they actually dealt with, or a near miss recession with a set of public policy responses in order to ameliorate the effects on voters, right? So there's a lot of corporate memory in Treasury about what you do in order to avoid a recession, and every recession response that Treasury has implemented since period, they really do in that department analyze it. You know, what worked, what didn't work, what do we need to do differently next time, right? And all of those experiences inform the next crisis. So there's that wealth of knowledge on the economic side of the ledger. Where the Commonwealth's been weak has been on the health side, in aged care, and now in the vaccine rollout, where can see this weakness. It's either poor advice, poor execution, whatever else. It's those elements of the Commonwealth's response have been consistently weak during the pandemic. So what's going on there? Well, perhaps what's going on there is that we haven't had a pandemic at this scale that the Commonwealth has had to manage for quite a long period of time. So there isn't that stored memory in the apparatus and the institutions of health at the Commonwealth level.
Yet at a state level, the public health authorities have, so
no, but
they haven't had a pandemic to learn from either, though.
No, but that's absolutely right, Pete. But they have had, the state governments have to deal with outbreaks, though. Outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease, outbreaks of, I don't know, some other Ross River fever, whatever, right? Like state health systems are attuned to the management of outbreaks and infections, right? Like they do deal with that at a sort of sub-level all the time. Whereas, I mean, this is a theory. I'm literally making this up as we talk, but I just think
That's what we're here for.
But it's kind of interesting because like the economic response, I think has, was very strong, right? Not flawless, but strong. But the health response at the Commonwealth level has not been strong at every point. So anyway, what do we make of that? That's a kind of interesting thought.
And, Ray Lee has made the point, she disputes the corporate memory in Treasury, sees number of redundancies given over the last 10 years or so. So, it's...
Oh, well, I'm taking that actually, you guys listening on, and look, obviously everyone can have different views about this, but I'm taking this, look, like Stephen Kennedy, the head of the Treasury Department, was actually Kevin Rudd's economic advisor during the GFC, right? He was in Rudd's office and now he's back running the Treasury. Martin Parkinson, former Treasury Secretary and former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, has written a very interesting short, and by that I mean 10 or 15,000 word essay about the lost decade or something like that. It's out at the moment. I think, I can't remember who's the publisher, Hachette maybe, I don't know. Anyway, It's worth chasing up. Parkinson, who ought to know, makes the point that that there is this kind of constant learning in Treasury about past recessions. Doesn't mean they get it all right. Doesn't mean it was perfect. I mean, you can criticise a number of elements of the government's economic response, but I'm just saying there is an obvious discernible difference in the strength of one response versus the strength of another.
Which brings us to the dismount, because I guess that's the other bit of new territory. So after the unprecedented investment behind people through JobSeeker and JobKeeper, that is all coming to an end. I think JobKeeper ends up being, is it the end of this month or the beginning? I think it's April. It's the phase out. JobSeeker, it's kind of almost back to New Start levels now. We did get a finding. I don't know if we'll get here that, a third of respondents think that those cutoffs are going to affect them personally and 40% affect the economy. So this is the other new territory we are now entering, in which is the other game changer, which I don't think will occur immediately. But this is where this is where people's minds are at before we actually see the full weight of it. Most people think that those that have made profits and paid dividends should probably repay the JobKeeper payments. There are a lot of businesses which have been surviving on JobKeeper and unlikely ever to return. There is an expectation that there are going to be businesses closed, and Treasury is predicting 150,000, I think, jobs to go.
It's in order.
People are worried about the economy, although they also say the scheme was far too expensive to continue any longer. So again, that kind of informed duality of concern, but also recognition that probably there was something that needed to happen. I don't know your reflection on any of those numbers, Katharine.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. People are obviously worried about the tapering out of the fiscal stimulus, and they should be, because it's obviously been like a giant flotation device for the economy over the last 12 months, and it's all about to head out the back door. And as you say, it's an informed concern. People are worried about the ongoing costs of the measures and also the impact on labour market participation, both entirely intelligent things to worry about. But they are concerned about whether or not the economic recovery, which has been pretty strong, will persist in the face of removing the flotation device. And we're all asking that question. We all wonder that. And we'll see. And then it's sort of the other moving part, like the story all comes together in a bunch of budget assumptions, right? And it's sort of like, you know, the theme of our conversation with you today has sort of been the linkage, I guess, between the vaccination program and the economy, right? And the economic recovery. If the vaccination program blows out or basically can't be delivered, we're heading into winter. It's going to be next year before the entire population is vaccinated or, you know, vaccinated to the point of herd immunity. You know, what feedback loops, you said before, Pete, like what feedback loop does that create? And then at the same time as you're withdrawing income support. So it's like, you know, to sort of summarize the whole the whole shebang and all these different moving parts, there's reasons for nervousness right now. And it is pretty obvious in these numbers that there's some informed nervousness out there about how this all comes together or doesn't.
With that final number that kind of rolls it all together, the schemes should have been extended at least until the vaccine program is fully rolled out. I guess the last thing, and we'll end the slideshow there and come up for air. There was lots of questions about what this will mean to an early election, which to me feels a little bit like jumping to the end of the story, but I am interested in your views. But I guess before then, the other question I've got for you is just in the lead up to the budget, how potent issues around debt and deficit actually are, or do you think that's an area where there's another 12 months of political leave pass?
I think there's a leave pass on that stuff for now. I think in an environment of low interest rates, I think there is a genuine leave pass on that. And given the vaccination program's gone off the rails, the government may well have to turn up with more fiscal support in order to support the economy through this transition. So I don't think there's a real sort of clear mud fight on that for, you know, probably 12 months or more. And that, to be honest, is a blessing, given that most of the conversation around debt and deficit, you know, over the last 20 years I've been reporting has been, you know, absolutely sort of bonehead stupid. So perhaps we're relieved of that for a period of time. But there was another question, Pete.
Elections. So the last thing, a lot of people, so is an election off this year?
Sorry. Yes, I'm in denial. It's sort of like a trigger word. Election.
It feels like it is, which is probably a good thing too.
Yeah, exactly. Where I just need to hide under a table and wait for it to pass. No, sadly not. No. Look, the same standard applies, which is governments call elections when they think they can win. That is the only rule of thumb. I guess it's possible that if all of this surprises on the upside and all of a sudden, you know, 40 million doses of Pfizer turn up tomorrow and it's all fab and we're all going nicely, there's an outside chance that the Prime Minister will go, I would think, late in the year, maybe October, November. But if it's all tricky, then the sort of weight of evidence points to an election next year rather than this.
Yeah, I feel like that, but then who wants to bet on these things in advance?
And it's the whole environment is really dynamic. You know, the election will happen when Scott Morrison thinks he can win it. The end.
And then, but there is an end date. Like, so that, I guess that is the other deadline for him. Like there is a 3-year period. And he's got to find a way through, which is almost a bit like what, and I guess that is the one deadline that is set in stone. There may not be a vaccine deadline, but there is still a political deadline, which is May 2021.
Yes, May. Yeah, I think it's May next year. Yeah.
Good times. Can't wait. Hey, and that's 22. Hey, thanks for your time today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. I know there's the world will probably be significantly different again in 2 weeks' time. But I think out of today, let's have a real look at whether this has affected the preparedness of people to take the shots, and hopefully that won't be something that's been one of the repercussions of this little bit of you know, snafu. But I'm sure there'll be something else coming to exercise this as well. So have a great day, everyone. Thanks for being part of this.
Thank you.
Cheers, Katharine.
Thank you all.